So we're about to begin the third Mishnah in the first chapter, the first Perek of Pirkei Avot, and we have we're introduced to another early authority. This is Antignos Ish Socho. So does somebody want to just read this nicely, clearly? And then
okay,
we'll be able to discuss it. You got it, Bill? Thank you.
I do, but this is the translation from Rabbi Shapiro's.
Rabbi, is your light on, by the way? You keep going black.
No.
Thank you.
I haven't been able to get the standard translation up on my Safari.
All right, this is okay. We'll all be able to follow. Each one of us has, maybe a slightly different translation, and that's actually going to enrich things. If somebody notices a particularly interesting variation, we can look at that too.
Okay.
Good.
So, Antigonus of Socho received transmission from Shimon HaTzadik. He used to say, "Do not serve in order to earn reward. Serve only to serve. In this way, the awe of heaven will be upon you."
Okay. So the translation is probably not exactly the same for a lot of other people, right? Does somebody else have a translation that they could share that's slightly different?
I'll share one. Yeah, I have one that's really different.
Really? All right.
Yeah. Antigonus of Socho received the tradition from Simon the Just.
Socho.
Of Soho?
Socho,
yeah, okay. He used to say, "Be not like servants who minister to their master upon the condition of receiving a reward, but be like servants who minister to their master without the condition of receiving a reward, and let the fear of heaven be upon you."
Okay. So a number of differences that we could notice in that. Before we get to the content, just a word about the sage himself. We don't know all that much about him, but he is a person who is identified here as a student, person who received the tradition from Shimon HaTzadik, from Simon the Just, Simon the Righteous. And just really quickly, we all, you don't have to be a big scholar, we all can notice, what is his name?
I don't know.
What's the difference?
Sounds like a Greek name.
The Greek name.
That's right. The difference between his name and Shimon HaTzadik's name is, palpable, right? Is absolutely clear.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Crazy. We're in chapter 3.
We're in chapter 1.
Oh.
We haven't moved that far. Mishnah 3.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm so lost.
Right. So no, we don't move that fast. You'll see. Stick around for us for a little while. You'll see that we don't move that fast.
Okay.
So
Mishnah 3.
right, Lou. So
Chapter 3,
anyway.
2024.
So the just to note that here we have, I mentioned that when we first got introduced to Shimon HaTzadik, we have here a little piece of evidence, just to note it, that here is a generation after Shimon HaTzadik where it's already possible to encounter people with non-Hebrew names. And I mentioned that Alexander, for instance, became a Jewish name in deference and in respect for and admiration, in homage to Alexander the Great, who spared the Jewish community in his onslaught to go conquer the world, and which included a lot of devastation and violence and murder. He was gentle with the Jewish community, the Judean community, and Shimon HaTzadik was given credit for that. Whatever that legend's real truth is not important, but the incursion of Hellenistic civilization into the Jewish community is a real factor. So, and of course, it becomes a huge subject of conflict at the time of the Maccabim, the time of the Hasmoneans. So a generation or two later. So here we have a person who was matter-of-factly named by his parents Antignos, and which speaks a little bit to a kind of assimilation without necessarily the negative connotations. They're mixing in with Hellenistic civilization. They feel comfortable with Hellenistic civilization. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're giving up their Jewish identity. It means that they feel included in both. So just the name there gives us that kind of historical marker that things are moving along in the history of the Jewish people, and they are now going to have to deal with a civilization, a new civilization for them, that's different than, for instance, the biblical civilization. The biblical forces of Babylonia and Assyria and Egypt in their ancient iterations, that fills up the entire Bible with all kinds of, the prophets are talking about this, and of course the Torah itself, the 5 books of Moses. There are all of these negotiations back and forth with all of our surrounding peoples, the Canaanites, etc. And that's now being washed away by a much different context. The major context for the development of Judaism from this point in the land of Israel, and we'll deal with other things in other places. But for here, in the time of the Mishnah, Hellenism is the major challenge confronting Jewish life, for good and for bad. So Antignos is now a loyal and respected person. His name is recorded as a sage and as a faithful disciple of Shimon HaTzadik. And now he gives us a teaching. So now we had the 2 different translations of how to read what he said, what the words are. I would say that Sarita's translation is the more literal translation, and then Bill's translation is a more adaptive translation. Let's hear the literal, and then let's hear the adaptation again, okay?
Okay. Antigonus of Socho received the tradition from Simon the Just. He used to say, "Be not like servants who minister to their master upon the condition of receiving a reward, but be like servants who minister to their master without the condition of receiving a reward, and let the fear of heaven be upon you."
Okay, and version 2.
And the freer translation, Antigonus of Socho received transmission from Shimon HaTzadik. He used to say, "Do not serve in order to earn reward, serve only to serve. In this way, the awe of heaven will be upon you."
Okay, so in listening to this, we've heard it already a couple of times. Anybody want to try to tease out some of the differences, and then we can think about what those differences might mean? Lynn, yeah.
Well, I'm on Safaria, and it says with the servants in expectation of receiving a word. So you've got condition, expectation, and the other word I can't remember, but they're all vastly different in severity, I guess, is what I'm trying to point out. So I'm wondering which would be. It's confusing me because they're in varying degrees of severity.
Welcome to the world of Jewish study. So yes.
Rabbi?
So, yeah.
The part about do not serve in order to earn reward reminds me of when I worked for the Jewish organizations. We were all afraid that they might end the tax deduction for giving money to charity. And everybody said, if there's no tax deduction, will we still get these wonderful gifts that allow us to do our work? So when he says serve only to serve, it reminds me of that confusion.
Right. So
No, the mistake is if you volunteer for an organization, you should expect punishment. Actually,
how do you know, John?
I'm kidding.
So
Hey, come here.
the issue then is we're talking about serving, and that word is
transmission.
no, that's receiving the transmission. That's the setup.
What was that?
Antignos Isocho received the tradition, the transmission, the tradition. It's the same thing here. I'm not going to dwell on that. From Shimon HaTzadik. So he is the chief disciple to be recognized as getting the real tradition. And now he used to say this. He used to say this, meaning he didn't say it once and we remember that he said it. He didn't write it, one time in the synagogue bulletin and then it just made a big impact. He used to say this again and again and again, maybe because it needs to be said again and again and again and again, right? Hu haya omer. He was wont to say. He used to say. So what he started talking about now is service, right? That's a common term in all of the translations, right? And then he says, what's the motivation for the service, right? So those are the two parts here. One question that I would bring up is service to whom or for what? Okay, and then we can get into the motivation question. So, what kind of service is being referred to here? Sarita, you want to say something?
Well, I just want to say that in the translation that Lou and I have, that relationship, the fact that there's a servant and a master is more explicit rather than Bill's translation seems to be this general about doing things because you think that you'll benefit from it. So this is setting up that you're specifically serving someone, and this would be serving God.
And Bill's translation says?
It says just do not serve in order to earn a reward, only to serve. Doesn't mention the master, the Rav.
It doesn't mention who is being served, right? So in the literal words, the Hebrew words, the Hebrew words are much more closely aligned with Sarita's translation. Yeah. Do not be ka'avadim, like slaves or servants. Avadim is a the words that we say avadim hayinu when we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Yeah. That's the word avadim, right? So don't be like servants or slaves. Hamishamshin et harav, who minister, who serve the master. Almanat, and almanat goes back to Lynn's question. Either it means in order to or on the condition of receiving a reward. Okay, so and then the negative we have to look at in a minute. So it's notable that Rabbi Rami Shapiro chooses, let me get rid of this master servant thing, right? That's really, it doesn't sound good in modern ears. He didn't write this this weekend or this week, but he's part of that that whole sense of let's get away from that. And he's trying instead to just use the word service as a laudable kind of concept without defining for what or to whom, right? But the original says very, very clearly that Antignos Isocho is conceiving of this as a relationship of a servant or even a slave, someone who works for a master. And then the obvious, uncontroversial interpretation is he's talking about serving God. God is the master of masters. And when you serve God, don't serve God for the sake, that would be another translation, for the sake of getting a reward. Yeah.
So this is like, sort of relates to the Shema, where you do something because you're loving God with all your soul and with all your heart, with all your might, as opposed to God is going to do something for me.
Okay. Unfortunately, in the Shema,
love here, right? This is a fear-based.
He doesn't say, he doesn't say anything about love, but also the Shema itself gets us in trouble, right? The first paragraph of the Shema talks all about just love God with all your heart. The second one says, and if you don't, guess what? But if you do, guess what? So the second one is all about getting a reward, right, or not. So so this is a little bit complicated, right? First, I would just point out that in a certain sense, as the good student of Shimon HaTzadik, we could see a certain connection between what Shimon HaTzadik says and what Antignos Socho says. Shimon HaTzadik said, as we saw previously, he says the world stands on three things. One is Torah, one is Gemilut Chasadim, acts of loving kindness, and the third one is
service.
Avodah.
Avodah. There's that. There's the service part. So, and we talked a little bit. Unfortunately, not enough, but a little bit. We did talk about it. Just kidding. About that term, and here we can see Antignos Socho as offering, commentary, exposition, elaboration on that particular pillar, right? This pillar, which is so essential. How are you supposed to engage in it? What are you supposed to be, what kind of attitude should you have? Or theoretically, what should be your expectation? If I do this, in what sense will I fit into the world's continuing to be sustained? Yeah, Lynn.
So in my translation, instead of the awe of heaven, it says, let the fear of heaven be upon you. So to me, that negates it a little bit. If you're serving without the expectation of reward, you're serving because it's the right thing to do, not because you fear retribution. He's bringing, at least in this translation, he's bringing it back around to if you don't or else.
Right. So the whole concept of fear of heaven is a very, very, discussed, even controversial topic. There's been a lot of discussion about what does that mean? What is it? What does the Torah mean by it? What do the sages mean by it? What kind of word should we use? Should we use the word fear? Should we use the word awe? Should we use the word reverence? Are we talking about being blown away by God's majesty, or are we talking about being afraid of God? Literally, that God is going to hurt us if we're not good, good boys and girls. So,
Rabbi,
who's that?
It's David Kanagas.
Yes.
Is this a good point to speak up?
I don't know. What you say?
I'm reading a text without the benefit of translation. So when I read this without translation, I read harav as harabim, the multitude.
Wrong.
The public.
No.
Am I? It's a different twist. In other words, don't serve the multitude. Don't conduct public service with the expectation of reward.
That's a not the accurate translation. It's an interesting. It could be, you could give a sermon and say here's the next thing, and again the connection then would be, back to the, I don't know if you were here when we asked the question, who are we serving, right? And for what purpose are we serving? And who do we see as actually that kind of authority? If we think about it, Rav, which that's the translation, that's the correct translation here. Rabbim is not the same thing as here as Rav. The Rav is the Avadim, and Rav mean master and servant. So, but you're right. The public opinion could be your master. All those politics shows where which show politicians never doing anything for the right reason. They only do it according to what the polls say they should do. Right, so yeah, then they make the people their master, but literally in terms of what the word means, it means the master. But
without spinning it as public opinion, it could be It could be a congregation. It could be much more neutral or beneficial. Just the public.
Well, so that gets us back again to the first part. What are the motivations for people to serve? Who do they think they're serving, or what do they think they're serving? Is there such a thing as serving an abstract cause without serving people per se?
Well, communists used to think so, that you could serve the goal of transforming the world and history while ignoring the needs and the existence of individual people.
Right. There's a very tragic, history of people creating some kind of abstract mission or goal, and the public be damned, or people be damned in general. So where do we say that that's bad, and when do we say no? It's so wonderful for a person to be an idealist and to buck public opinion, and they don't care what the public thinks because they're wrong. A simple example, somebody in Germany in the 30s and 40s, public opinion was growing and growing and growing, and was massively in favor of Nazism. A person who doesn't says, "Damn public opinion." So is that bad or good? It's clear to us that person would be a hero, and unfortunately probably a martyr. So when do you go with public opinion and when don't you go with public opinion is a huge question. It's interesting that we have completely now walked away from serving God, right? That's not the topic that's occupying us. Sarita.
Our book here has a comment on the reward thing. Excuse me. It says, according to Jewish teaching, it is not wrong to hope for God's reward of righteous living. Even a detractor of Judaism admits that piety is not content to stretch out its hands to the empty air. It must meet an arm descending from heaven. It needs a reward, not for the reward's sake, but in order to be sure of its own reality, in order to know that there is a communion of God with man and a road by which to reach it. Someone named Wellhausen that's from. However, Antigonus maintains
just for a second, I want to just point out, Wellhausen is Julius Wellhausen. Wellhausen was a notorious anti-Semite, who was a major founder of biblical criticism. He was a Protestant minister who really was one of the founders of the modern study of the Bible, and he was, in that sense, pretty much a genius. However, he did actually hate Judaism, and part of his whole study of the Bible was to prove how the Christian development was the best thing, and that the Bible itself was, very bad. Yeah, but here he is trying. He was a man of religion. He is a man of faith, and he's bringing up a real problem, right? He's bringing up this problem that we've been sort of dancing around. What does it mean to, if you really think that you don't want to get a reward, I mean, do you really want to keep on doing something that has no success to it? I mean, if serving God in your mind is that you're gonna bring freedom and liberation to everyone, so does it mean? And guess what? Don't ever expect that to happen, right? Is that what is that fair? Do we need some kind of confirmation that God cares about what we're doing? That God doesn't just slap us down when we try to do what we think is genuine service for God? How do we deal then with whether God really cares about this?
Right.
So the point that I'm hearing from Wellhausen is, don't we need some kind of confirmation that God is in this with us together?
Yeah.
Then Lynn.
Well, Rabbi Shapiro's.
Wait, Josie is speaking first.
All right.
Thank you. Yes, it brings up for me that comment, not knowing the background of the man who wrote it. This whole idea of our relationship with God, like if we're just operating in a vacuum because we're being good because good is good, then we are leaving out the relationship that's so important in Judaism. It's a very interesting question.
Yes, thank you, Lynn, and then Bill.
Theoretically, theoretically, if it's saying to serve God, presumably based on all the other teachings, based on the Bible, based on the writings, if you and when you do that, the reward is in the community. The reward is that you have a society that functions well and that takes care of the outliers and that supports good behavior. So it seems that if that's what it's talking about, serving God really does mean, in a secondary sense, having a good, full, healthy community that takes care of itself.
So what if you feel that you don't have that community? How do you serve God without that community?
That's a good question.
Okay.
That's a good question.
All right, Bill, you wanted to speak.
Rabbi Shapiro's translation seems to suggest not that the serving in order to or not in order to do it, but that if you serve without regard to the reward, in fact, the awe of heaven will be upon you. It's just it's sort of like the natural consequences of behavior. He's got a note on this particular Mishnah, and he says, when you act for reward, you focus not on the deed but on the doer. When there is no thought of reward, there is no thought of the doer. When there is no thought of the doer, the deed is done with simplicity and grace. This is living with the awe of heaven.
So we have a little bit, right?
It's a little bit of a different,
right. So that last part of the sentence, he has a difference in his translation than the one that we have, where he says it'll happen that way. It'll
right.
be that will be the natural consequence of serving without expectation, without desire for reward. Is that you will be filled with awe and reverence for what's really precious in the world and in life. I want to, at this moment, bring up the struggle that we're watching all around us, and that we have to find our own way to take part in, of making this country a more righteous place, and of standing up for the image of God that every human being carries, even a black person. So the fact that we have to say such a silly thing as Black Lives Matter, we actually have to say that because people have not made Black Lives Matter in the most fundamental way. So we're involved in a cataclysm at this moment within our own society. When I think back about one of the giants of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King of blessed memory, many people have seen this chilling tape of him speaking, I think the night before he was murdered, where he said, I don't know that I'm going to see this happen. Right? I don't know that I'm going to actually get to see my vision realized. But I see the vision. And it's chilling because it was so prophetic that somebody decided to snuff out a holy man, as if that's a worthwhile thing to do. But his point in relation to this, what the connection to me is, he's saying, I'm not doing this to get a reward. And the reward is not just I'm not doing this to get rich. I'm not doing this even so that I personally will see that I succeeded.
I'm just doing it because
I'm doing it because it has to be, because this is the right service that needs to be done right now. And it's a service not to necessarily the survey of how many people think I'm right. And that in those days, that wasn't the majority, but it was to some other higher ideal of humanity and of God, that this is what God really is calling each and every one of us to do. And he's hearing the call. And in that sense, he's filled with reverence. He's filled with awe and even fear of God. In a certain sense, if you hear that kind of call, then you're afraid. If you hear that call and you don't do anything about it, how will I be able to look at God in the face? How will I be able to look at my own children in the face if I don't listen to this call? So yes, there's a possibility here that we need to actually entertain the notion of fear. We have to stop now. To be continued. Oh, that's very important. Next week, we're not meeting because next week is a special program at 10 o'clock for about an hour and a half. There's going to be a virtual tour of Jewish Amsterdam that's being offered to us. Thanks to Rabbi Steve Kushner, the Rabbi Emeritus of Ner Tamid. He used to bring people to Jewish Amsterdam every year. So he has connections there, and this is a program that I hope people will enjoy. So next week we won't study together. I look forward to meeting everybody again and studying the following Sunday. Okay?
Thank you.
Sei gesund, alle Mann.